Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We'll give it a couple more minutes for folks to join in before we get started. Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Cynthia Saturn with the Foundation for California Community Colleges. Today, we hope to provide an analysis about the One Big Beautiful Bill in collaboration with an attorney from Immigrant Legal Resource Center. This webinar is being recorded. We have just a few housekeeping rules to go over. So this webinar is being recorded. All presentation and materials will be shared out after the presentation. And then please utilize the Q&A box for all questions. We will try our best to answer them throughout the presentation or at the end. And closed captioning is available for the presentation. And with that, I'll hand it over to Nithya to introduce herself and kick us off.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you to everyone attending today's presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. My name is Nithya Nathan Pinot. I am a policy attorney and strategist with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office, and I focus my work on federal policy with an emphasis on legislative advocacy, and I work at the intersection of the criminal legal system and the immigration system. So that's sort of a little bit of my background and what I bring to the work. Before I came to the ILRC, I spent 10 years representing folks in immigration courts around the country. And, I can just say that we're in a really unique time. And this bill that we're about to talk about is really going to change the way the immigration system works. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about this. As Cynthia mentioned, if questions pop up, please put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and I am going to make sure to leave time to address as many questions as possible. Before we jump into our content, I just wanted to share a little bit about Immigrant Legal Resource Center, or ILRC, for anyone who's joining us today who might be unfamiliar. As our name suggests, we're known for being a legal resource center. We are based in San Francisco with staff in California, Texas, and Washington, D.C. And we have sort of three major areas of our work. We want to build capacity in the field, so serving alongside our immigrant community members, strengthening their leadership and their leadership of our grassroots community partners. We also are known for putting out legal resources and legal information for legal professionals, both in the immigration and the criminal legal system. And we're also known for our policy advocacy, which involves work at both the local, state, and federal levels. And so I contribute to that work in the federal space and also support some of the state legislative work that our team engages in both California and Texas. Just wanted to start by giving a little bit of an overview. We're going to talk about the changes made by HR 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. You'll hear me say HR 1, and part of that is that I don't like to repeat the name of the bill because it is part of the messaging campaign of the folks who drafted and pushed for this bill. And so I'll be using HR 1 to refer to the bill, but you will also see references to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is the name of the bill as it was passed. So the overview is going to cover some changes to healthcare coverage, some changes to nutrition assistance programs, and some changes to the immigration system. And that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time. But if you have any questions about any of these pieces, of course, please feel free to ask them. I also just wanted to share that this visual here is from a report that we did with several of our partners at NIJC, the Immigrant Defense Project and Detention Watch Network. And it's a report that we issued earlier this year with a summary of some of our policy recommendations. And so if you're interested in looking at it, you absolutely can. It is on our website. All right. So I just want to talk a little bit of process before we jump into the substance, um, and get, sort of the big picture of how we got here. Many of you may know that this bill was passed through the budget reconciliation process. This process allows a party that controls both houses of the Congress. So when we're talking about the federal government, that's the House of Representatives and the Senate, to pass legislation through a simple majority. That means all they need is half of the votes in the House and half of the votes in the Senate. And we know that right now there is Republican control in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And so they were able to pass this bill without any Democratic votes for this bill. It was signed into law in July 2025. And, while there was a lot of advocacy around the cuts to healthcare and cuts to nutrition assistance with good reason, another piece of the sort of lasting legacy of this bill is that it is the largest investment in immigration enforcement in the history of this country. More than $170 billion will be invested in immigration enforcement as a result of this bill. And so I want to make sure that we're talking about, where this money was cut from and then what it's being poured into. So it's being cut from programs that provide healthcare and nutrition assistance to our communities, which are life saving programs that allow people to live and be safe and well. And it's being invested into the immigration enforcement and detention system, which is tearing families apart and causing great harm to people all across this country. And we know that California is seeing a lot of this harm play out, especially since the administration's enforcement in LA ramped up so significantly in June and has continued to be so concentrated in Southern California, all over the city of LA and LA County and the surrounding areas. Um, I'm going to jump into our next slide. I do want to address one. We have one question about when does the bill take effect? So there are certain parts of the bill that went into effect immediately, and there are other parts that are going to go into effect later that will be phased in. So I do have references throughout the presentation as to when certain things are going to take effect. And if there's something specific that's not in here and you have a question about when it's going to take effect, I'm happy to follow up on those specific pieces as well. Yeah. Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about healthcare. You may have heard already that this bill will dramatically change the way that healthcare coverage looks in our country. Unfortunately, we live in a country where for many people, their ability to be covered by healthcare or have healthcare coverage is tied to either their employment or their status as a student. And for people who fall outside of being eligible for healthcare through employment or through a family member or something like that, we do have both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is designed for folks over age 65 who are maybe retired. And so it's meant to be a way for seniors to have access to health care and health insurance. And Medicaid is designed to provide healthcare access to low income folks, and that includes children. This law cuts more than $1 trillion, and it's projected that that will lead to about 12 million Americans losing health insurance coverage. Another important piece that you may hear being discussed a lot in the news right now is the fact that the Affordable Care Act, which you may also hear referred to as Obamacare or the Obama Insurance Plan or Obama Healthcare Exchanges, that bill had put into place federal subsidies to make purchasing healthcare more affordable for folks. And this bill failed to renew those subsidies. And so we'll find that folks that are currently purchasing insurance on the exchange will lose that subsidizing piece from the federal government that makes those affordable, and healthcare costs will skyrocket, and many people will lose access to health insurance in that way as well. It's being discussed in the context of the current appropriations fight. The federal government is in the process where they have to fund the government before September 30th at midnight, or there will be a government shutdown. And Democrats are trying to get Republicans to put this piece into the bill so that these subsidies don't go away and folks can keep their health care. And so I see we have a question about if the government's shut down by the end of September, does the bill affect and schedule, it will be adjourned or impacted? The government shutdown doesn't necessarily change the dates when certain pieces of the bill will go into effect. And so I think unfortunately we will see some of these pieces already went into effect in July, and some are set to go into effect at the end of this year or the end of next year. So unfortunately, we're not really going to see a significant change to the timeline of rollout. And I am going to address when there will be specific changes to Medicaid to address that question as well. So, we're going to talk first about Medicaid and CHIP, which is the Children's Health Insurance Program. Starting in October 2026, only lawful permanent residents who have met the 5-year period, Cubans or Haitians, and people from Micronesia, Palau, or the Marshall Islands who live in the United States will be eligible for these programs. That's a really dramatic change. And I have in here at the bottom too that it's important to note that many states still cover lawfully present children or pregnant immigrants as well, who can enroll in their state healthcare programs without a waiting period. And so I think that will also be important to note that while there have been cuts from federal programs, some states are trying to step in to provide additional care and additional access for folks who are now going to be cut out of these programs. For Medicare, starting in July 2025, so this piece is already in effect. Lawful permanent residents, Cubans or Haitians, and folks who are from Micronesia, Palau, or the Marshall Islands. One thing to note is if you are a person who is already enrolled in Medicare, you can keep your coverage until January 4th, 2027. I think, some of this is intentional so that we're not automatically cutting off a large number of seniors from healthcare and giving them time to try to find an alternate source of healthcare or to purchase healthcare in a state exchange. But yeah, that change is going to be rolled out in the early 2027. To address the question about folks who are DACA recipients who have healthcare insurance through their employer provided insurance is not one of the specific categories that has been cut. These are federal programs. So I think that's another piece where, you know, there may be other changes that DACA recipients are facing, but if they're getting health insurance through their employer, they should continue to be eligible for that coverage to continue. There are additional changes, as I mentioned, to the Affordable Care Act insurance subsidies. These are subsidies that allow folks to have more affordable rates when they're purchasing healthcare on the state exchange. And this change is going to go into effect on December 31, 2026. So we still have over a year. But only lawful permanent residents, Cubans or Haitians, and people from Micronesia or Palau or the Marshall Islands would have access. So I think that's just something to keep in mind as well. Um, that's a lot of folks are going to be cut off from these subsidies that make their healthcare that they're purchasing off the exchange affordable right now. So looking at our questions, so the government shutdown right now, the main piece that Democrats are negotiating around is around trying to maintain some of the ACA subsidies and then also funding for rural hospitals that was also cut um, under the HR1 package. So right now, Republicans have taken the position that they're not going to negotiate on any of the demands that Democrats have raised. They have not sat down at the table with Democratic leadership and negotiated out what's going to happen. The House on Friday morning passed what's called a clean continuing resolution for 7 weeks. That means it just continues current government funding levels, doesn't change or add things. And so, no Democrats, well, there was one Democrat that voted for that bill, but the rest of the Democrats did not vote for it. And it did pass the House on Friday. Right now, both the House and the Senate are not in session this week. They're coming back on Monday, and they have 2 working days to try to pass a continuing resolution. But based on what both sides are saying now, they don't have an agreement on how to move forward. I see here also a question asking like who's currently or previously eligible and who will be eligible. I'm gonna send a follow-up resource that'll give folks in one place where you can find all of this information. And so you can find like exactly what you're looking for if you're trying to look back for this. And you'll also have access to the slides. So if you want to look back to this, you will absolutely be able to look back and, use it as a reference for any future questions that you have that come up. Um, okay, just taking a look at the questions that are coming up. Um, in terms of how it might affect financial aid, I think one of the pieces that we'll have to look at is if people lose access to, if the sort of financial situation and the information that you put on your FAFSA when you apply for financial aid changes for your family or for the individual applicant, then you would need to absolutely, factor that in. But losing access to healthcare through one of these programs on its own, like, shouldn't change the person's eligibility for financial aid. Um, okay, and then we've got a question about permanent residents who are on Medicare. Will they be eligible for Medicare unless they become citizens? So let's go back. Um, Lawful permanent residents can get Medicare. They will still get Medicare. So if you look at on the Medicare side, we're saying starting July 25th, these immigrants can get Medicare. That includes the lawful permanent residents, or as some folks say, green card holders, will still continue to be eligible. So you do not have to naturalize to keep your Medicare coverage if you are a green card holder. But that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. All right, I'm gonna keep moving because we've got more content to cover, and I'm gonna keep trying to answer as many questions as I can as we go, but also want to leave a bit of time at the end if it's possible. Let's talk about nutrition assistance. How many people hear this referred to as SNAP. It's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. This is a key social safety net program, and this change went into effect in July 2025. So the only people who now can get SNAP are lawful permanent residents, adults, lawful permanent resident children. And for children, there isn't a waiting period, but there is a waiting period of 5 years for adults. Cubans or Haitians, and also people from Micronesia, Palau, or the Marshall Islands. It's also important to note that if you have a mixed status family, that the US citizens or the immigrants in your family who meet these requirements can still get access to SNAP. And so, even if not every member of your family will be eligible, if some of them are still eligible, that benefit is still available. And just to give a sense of like how important SNAP is nationwide and for California, in 2024 there were 40 million SNAP recipients nationwide. And in California, there were 5.3 million people, which is about 14% of the state population. It's about 1 in 7 Californians who benefit from SNAP. 55% are families with children, 36 are families with elderly or disabled adults, and 30% are working families. And so it's really this impact of this change to SNAP is really dramatic. I don't really think it can be overstated. And that's really important to just keep in mind. To address the question about the 5-year waiting period, that's exactly what it means is that once you become a legal permanent resident, you can't immediately get nutrition assistance. You have to wait for a period of 5 years. And so there's a question here about do these programs exclude Latinos? Like the categories do not address a person's, race, ethnicity, or national origin. They only address, their status. And so it'll be sort of dependent on status. To address the question of immigrants who continue to be eligible to receive SNAP, it'll be lawful permanent resident adults who've met the 5-year waiting period, lawful permanent resident children, Cubans or Haitians, and people from Micronesia, Palau, or the Marshall Islands. So that's important to note. I want to jump into our next section to talk a little bit more about immigration. In this section, we're going to talk about um, sort of 3 major areas: immigration detention, immigration enforcement, and new fees and fines that are going to really dramatically change the way that people are able to access immigration benefits. During our presentation, I've just pulled out a few examples of the new fees and fines, but I am going to follow up this presentation with a more comprehensive list. So if you have specific questions about a certain application and what the fee might be with that attached to that application, that'll be available as a follow-up because there are a lot of changes and we could probably spend the whole hour just talking about fees and fines. And there's so much other information I wanted to be able to get in here today that we're gonna pull out a few examples in our discussion and then I'll follow up so that you'll be able to look up more specific pieces. We're going to talk about immigration detention, immigration enforcement first. Immigration detention is going to dramatically expand under this bill. We are talking about $45 billion being funneled directly into the U.S. immigration detention system to detain adults and families together. It's really important to note that this bill explicitly authorizes the expansion of family immigration detention. So, this means family units being incarcerated in cages together. And the goal that ICE has stated is that they want to have 100,000 beds nationwide for ICE custody. Currently, the number of people in ICE custody is hovering around 59,000. A few weeks back, they hit 60,000, which was a historical high in the country of this nation, or a historical high in this nation. We have not seen that many people in detention at one time. And so we're in a really remarkable time with already how much detention capacity exists. And the continued expansion is going to be really horrific. One thing I just want to highlight is that we're talking about a system that is already inhumane and cruel, and that, just through the end of June of this year, there were 13 deaths in ICE custody. And, there's a lot of advocates and some reporting out there that suspect that these numbers are sort of underreporting what's actually happening in ICE custody to people. Um, One of the sort of big picture takeaways is that this is really going to harm immigrant communities across the country. And the only people who really benefit from this dramatic expansion of immigration detention are the private prison corporations that are gaining large contracts to detain huge numbers of folks in facilities across the country. In order to achieve their goals, ICE is going to use several different types of, several different types of facilities. Like I said, they're going to rely a lot on private prisons to be able to expand to the level that they're hoping to expand to. They're going to use state correctional facilities, and we have already seen this. You may be familiar with the example of the Everglades Detention Center, which the administration referred to as Alligator Alcatraz. That facility has been the subject of a lot of litigation because the state of Florida really dramatically expanded the authority given to them to build a state-run immigration detention center. This is a pretty unprecedented and new way for states to engage in immigration detention. We know that there will also be some federal correction facilities that may reopen, or that may be open and then have part of their facility rented out to ICE, and that they'll also use intergovernmental service agreements to have contracts with local jails. And, a lot of that is through relationship building with local sheriffs so that they can have access to more bed space in these local counties where they may not have any bed space right in this moment. So ICE has a lot of tools at their disposal right now to be able to dramatically expand to the scale that we believe, they're hoping to achieve with the funding from this bill. And, with quadrupling their detention budget, they have no shortage of funds. And so it's really about them pursuing all of these different types of facilities at one time to make this dramatic expansion that they're going for. Um, and so while we're talking about how this dramatic expansion is happening, I also want to talk about some of the organizing that's happening in California and across the country against detention and against the expansion of immigration detention. There is so much good work being done in California through the Dignity Not Detention Coalition. This is their logo for that coalition. ILRC participates in that coalition along with a number of other faith-based groups, community groups, legal groups, all against the expansion of incarceration of immigrants in the state of California. And Detention Watch Network is also running the Communities Not Cages campaign, which is a national campaign that is tracking and fighting the expansion of immigration detention. And there are lots of ways that you can get plugged into these spaces if you're interested in joining these efforts, learning more, and finding out ways to fight back against the dramatic expansion of immigration detention. So I just want to inject these opportunities for people to feel like there's ways to get involved and ways to sort of fight back, because I know when we're covering this topic of all of the changes that are being made to immigration detention and enforcement, it can be quite heavy. And so I just want to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge the amazing work that colleagues are doing across the country to organize the community and fight back against immigration detention expansion. Um, just in California, we talked about a couple of the different ways that detention is being expanded, but FCI Dublin is a notorious federal prison reopening for immigration detention. It was closed because there was a long history of abuse against the people who were incarcerated there. And so there has been a lot of fantastic organizing trying to fight that reopening. You may also be aware of the California City Detention Center that was opened without proper permitting, and all of the fight that the community is engaging to try to shut that facility down. And then the Adelanto and Desert View Annex facilities are being operated in Southern California and have seen their populations grow dramatically because of all of the enforcement that's happening in Southern California right now. Um, I'm going to shift to talk a little bit about enforcement and specifically border militarization. The HR1 package included $47 billion for border wall construction. It also included $7 billion for more Customs and Border Protection or CBP agents and vehicles, $5 billion for more facilities and checkpoints, $6.2 billion for border technology and surveillance, and an additional $10 billion for border enforcement purposes. This one is written in a very vague way, so it can really be funneled towards any surveillance, technology, checkpoint, personnel, border wall needs that are related to the border. Throughout the bill, they've created kind of a lot of leeway in how they may use some of the funding. I think that's a intentional sort of like it's an intentional flexibility being written into the bill to allow the agencies to use the money in, the ways that are going to meet their goals. One thing I just want to sort of address is the border wall construction and fortification has been you know, opposed by immigrants' rights folks, but also environmental groups and tribal groups for the disrespect to tribal land sovereignty and the use of eminent domain by the government to continue to build these barriers that do not make anyone more safe, but they do create a lot of disruption to the environment and tribal communities. That's a great question that just came in. Who regulates the spending and accountability for these funds? Congress. So Congress has the power of the purse, and they also have the ability to exercise oversight over how the money that they appropriate is spent. And one of the things that we work on a lot is to work with members of Congress to try to get them to really engage in effective oversight over DHS and ICE and CBP, because historically they have not been good about producing data that they're asked for, producing reports that they're asked for. And I think that's a huge sort of problem with the agency, is they are not very transparent, and it continues to be a real challenge it's something that we will continue to advocate for with Congress, because we believe that that sort of transparency and oversight piece of their work is so important, and it is why we elect folks to go to Congress. We want them to, we want them to decide how money is spent, and then once it's allocated, we want them to make sure that it is not being used um, outside of the original intention of how it was appropriated. In addition to all of that money that's going to CBP, there's been $32 billion allocated for ICE agents and enforcement and removal operations. That includes all of the like support resources that they might need, like vehicles and things like that. This funding is available to ICE through September 30th of 2029. The agency has announced that they would like to hire 10,000 new agents. They have issued press releases stating that they have had more than 150,000 applications. I think based on what we've seen from the first 9 months of this administration, we've really seen that their enforcement tactics are completely based on racial profiling using extreme force and violence. And I'm honestly very concerned about the fact that they've changed the requirements so much for ICE agents. They've shortened the training significantly to just 47 days. They've changed age requirements and education requirements. And then after the Supreme Court's decision that came down, about 2 weeks ago now in Nome versus Vasquez Perdomo, um, ICE is more even emboldened to engage in racial profiling in their enforcement actions. And I think that gets to one of the questions that was asked about, how might this impact, Latino community members, Latino families. That case specifically talked about the way that enforcement has been happening in Southern California, where people have been profiled based on where they are working, whether they are speaking Spanish, the type of work that they are doing. And so, um, this is, it puts us in a really precarious situation because of what the Supreme Court has said in this decision, because we know that even though we will read it more narrowly, that ICE is using this decision as sort of support for a lot of the really um, a lot of the tactics that they've used to drive the large number of arrests. We know that they are working on a quota-based system. They are just trying to arrest as many people as possible without regard for people's civil rights. I know that you have all seen horrific videos of this, people being pulled out of cars after agents break the window, of people being wrestled to the ground, of ICE agents sitting on top of people. The amount of force and the violence that they're using in these arrests is so excessive and so disturbing. And it is a real fear that this agency will continue to be emboldened by um, this massive influx of resources and massive hiring of new officers with very short training period. And that's not to say that training can fix the issues with the agency, but just that with even condensing and shortening the training, it may be quite difficult to really hold agents accountable. I see that we had a hand up. I don't know if someone wanted to jump in and ask a question at this point, or if we can. Um,
I'm not sure if anyone have their hand up, but if
okay.
you do, please utilize the Q&A box so we can get through those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to address here because this is so related to enforcement. Someone here asking about what's the government's purpose in increasing detention. The administration has announced that they want to try to deport 1 million people each year. So far this year, it's estimated that they have arrested around 400,000 people. And one of the things that they are using as a tool to drive this mass deportation effort is more detention beds. And that is the purpose for the dramatic expansion in immigration detention. Um, there's another question here about folks who are asylees. Can they be detained randomly too? I can just say, based here in Washington, D.C., we have seen a significant increase in enforcement during the federal occupation of our city. And one thing that I will say is that our local rapid response network has seen folks who have asylum, who maybe like did not have their like proof of their status immediately on them, be arrested and detained. They should not be arrested and detained, but as we've seen, ICE is really about arresting people and then kind of asking questions later and getting things straightened out later. They've been extremely aggressive towards folks, and as I was talking about, they've been using trying to catch as many people as possible. And so profiling people by where they work, the language they speak, how they look, where, whether they're waiting at a bus stop, things like that. And so there is a lot of concern for folks. In our Know Your Rights work, we have been advising people, to carry their proof of status on them if they can. I think in some cases, like that can be a protective step so that you can try to quickly show that you do have status. Um, there's also a large amount of money, a $29 billion fund for other enforcement activities. This includes expedited removal processes. You may have seen the news of immigrants being arrested at immigration court hearings and being taken into detention to be put into a rapid deportation process, and that's what expedited removal is. This administration is using this rapid deportation process, and expanding the people that it can apply to dramatically, and so that's one area where they're allocating more money to be able to process all of these rapid deportations. They're also allocating money to what's called the 287G program. This program allows local law enforcement agencies to sign essentially a memorandum with ICE and say that those local law enforcement agencies will engage in immigration enforcement. So that means even if the person doesn't have a state law violation, that local law enforcement agency can initiate contact with them based on a suspected immigration violation. This program is really problematic, and the ILRC has been organizing against this program since its inception. We have a map on our website where you can look and see where the current agreements are. Just in the last 9 months, this program has grown tenfold in terms of the number of agreements that are signed, and a number of state legislatures have also been contributing to the dramatic growth by mandating that all of their local law enforcement agencies engage in these memorandums with ICE. So, some examples of those states are Florida, Texas, and Georgia. And in Virginia, the governor actually signed an executive order mandating that local law enforcement agencies sign these agreements. And so it's a way of sort of co-opting local resources for immigration enforcement when that's supposed to be the purview of the federal government. And another piece is that there's money allocated for processing of asylum claims while people wait outside the United States. We know that this is an extremely dangerous and unsafe way for asylum seekers to go through the asylum process, and that they may not even be able to successfully make their claim because they're in an unsafe environment, or they're facing danger while they're in Mexico. And so it really dramatically will impact people's ability to access, the life-saving protection of asylum. There's also money allocated to the Department of Justice to prosecute migration-related offenses. This includes entry and re-entry into the United States. It also includes what's called harboring. So maybe that may be, a person who's helping someone come to the United States without status, or providing them resources to do so. And also violations of the registration requirement. You may have heard earlier this year the administration um, implemented a provision of the law that requires people to non-citizens to register if they do not already have some kind of like pending application. Um, there's more information about that on our website. It's a really complex issue and something that we recommend that people do individual consultations on to figure out what the best way is to move forward. But you can really see that the enforcement goes beyond the Department of Homeland Security, ICVP. It really goes into the Department of Justice as well. So HR1 also has a dramatic change to the way that immigration fees work. There absolutely were applications that had fees before this bill. I want to be clear. There have always been some applications that have fees associated in the immigration system. But I think one thing that's unique and notable about this is that the bill puts fees on many forms of humanitarian protection, including asylum. And these fees are so high that it's going to make it practically impossible for many people to apply for these benefits. And also to make clear that some of these fees are entirely new, some are a dramatic increase, and that the numbers that I have in here are minimums that are from the statute. Like I mentioned earlier on, I think it's important to like if you have a question about a specific application or a specific form, I'm going to have a more comprehensive list that'll go out to everyone who registered. And so you'll be able to access that information and reference, any specific form that you might have questions about. Like I said, asylum applications now have a $100 fee that requires an additional $100 for every year that a person's asylum application remains pending. As you might know, there is a nationwide backlog of years and years for asylum petitions. I know many folks who have asylum applications that have been pending for 5 to 7 years, and having to pay $100 every year is a really significant barrier. Also, special immigrant juvenile status. This is a form of humanitarian protection that's designed for youth who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected. And so they are often young people who don't have the supportive parents or other trusted adults. And they're imposing a new fee of $250, which is going to be an insurmountable barrier for many of these young people. They're also implementing what's called a border crossing penalty, so a new fee for a person who's apprehended between ports of entry without authorization, with no exception for asylum seekers. Even though they may still have the right to actually apply for asylum, they'll be subject to this fee of $5,000, and that's a minimum. Um, I know that many folks have work authorization based either on a pending asylum application or parole or other sort of temporary status. So these fees are being raised significantly. The minimum fee is $550, and it's really important to note here they're saying this is non-waivable. When I was in practice, I very often filed fee waivers for my clients because they had financial hardship or another circumstance that just made it impossible for them to pay for the fee for a work authorization. So, taking away fee waivers is a really dramatic step as well. It's also important to note, fees for an issuance of a visa, fees for issuance of temporary protected status, although temporary protected status has been repealed and limited in so many ways under this administration that there are many fewer people who are even eligible for temporary protected status. So, just wanted to flag these as sort of initial dramatic increases. There's just a little bit more I want to get through, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Um, these immigration court fees are also really significant increases and will dramatically impact for people who have a case with the immigration court and are trying to file an appeal or to apply for their permanent residence through the immigration court. These will also be really significant penalties. There's also a $5,000 fee if you are ordered deported and because you failed to appear. So that does happen in some cases. Sometimes people don't get notice of their immigration court hearing and they are not able to appear because they didn't know about it. But under this regime, you would still be charged $5,000 for that, for the failure to appear in court on that date, which is an extremely punitive measure. I mentioned earlier that right now we're in the middle of a big appropriations fight in the federal government. In addition to the efforts to restore the subsidies for Affordable Care Act healthcare purchases, we're also seeing some members who are interested in trying to use the funding bills as a way to restore legal access programs for immigrants. You may be aware that the legal orientation program, legal services for unaccompanied youth, and the National Qualified Representative Program, which is a program for representation for immigrants who are found to be not have the mental competence to represent themselves in immigration court. All three of these programs face dramatic cuts. And so there are some folks in Congress who are trying to use this appropriations process to get this funding restored. Right now, legal access for immigrants is so limited, and we know that having a lawyer can be the biggest um, sort of deciding factor or sort of helpful factor in the outcome of an immigration case. So the ILRC really is standing behind the restoration of this funding for these vital programs for so many people. We have got lots of questions in the chat already or in the Q&A box, and so I'll start moving through as many of those as I can. And for any folks who have a more specific question about a specific application or anything like that, I'll make sure that the follow-up materials get to you. The removal of ACA subsidies, would it also apply for lawful immigrants? So if the subsidies are not continued, then it will impact all the people that rely on those. And it'll be a really dramatic change because those subsidies were designed to keep the cost of purchasing healthcare on an exchange affordable. In our system where healthcare costs are rising so dramatically, the loss of subsidies will impact all of the people who use those state exchanges to purchase their healthcare coverage. I see here a question. Can the Department of Justice give a direct order to cancel H.R. 1? That's a great question. The only way that this bill could be repealed or stopped would be for Congress to pass another piece of legislation to say, this funding is no longer allocated to detention and enforcement, and these changes to healthcare and SNAP are also going to be rolled back. So unfortunately, the DOJ on its own can't change a bill that's passed by Congress. One thing that agencies can do, and that this administration does quite a lot, is that they can decide how they direct their resources, their staffing, and how they prioritize certain issues. So we've actually seen that this Department of Justice has funneled a lot of their resources towards immigration prosecutions, and they're also funneling resources towards threatening jurisdictions that have what are called sanctuary policies, but in many cases, these are just welcoming ordinances or policies that allow immigrants to live and be safe in community. So while they can't change an act of Congress, they do have power in the way that they use their own resources to implement a bill like this. And so that's definitely something that is important to keep in mind. There's a question here about how much money detention centers are getting per person that they detain per day. That's a really good question. I don't have the exact figure, but I certainly It is a profitable endeavor for private prisons, and I think that's one of the reasons why we saw the stock prices of companies like the Geo Group and CoreCivic, which are two of the largest corporations that run private immigration detention centers in the United States. We saw those stocks increase significantly in value after the election because people knew that there was going to be an investment, a shift towards private immigration detention, and that the administration was going to make funds available for that. And so this was sort of the fulfillment of that promise. This bill allocated 45 billion, and these we know that these private prison companies will be able to profit off of all of this money that's allocated. Here I see there's an example being provided by a person saying that an asylee was not allowed to provide their documents and was detained for 20 days in Texas with her 6-year-old daughter. That is a horrible story, and I'm so sorry that happened. Thank you for sharing that. We have absolutely seen reports like that across the country. I know I have seen it happen here in DC through our local rapid response network, and it is a terrifying reality that ICE is going after folks who, have status, have, um, but may not, immediately be able to provide that proof in the initial interaction. Um, I see here there's a question about the possibility that ICE will enter sensitive places like churches. That is a great question. We know that at the beginning of this year, the administration changed the previous policy that limited the ability of ICE and other immigration enforcement to access places like schools and churches. There is ongoing litigation over this policy, and while we don't have a definitive answer to that question, we do know that in many places, ICE is engaging in enforcement near these sensitive locations. Near schools, we are seeing parents who are getting arrested, dropping kids off for school or immediately after dropping a child off of school. At least here in our local area, we have not seen raids on houses of worship, but I know that that's an ongoing concern for people, and that, with the change in policy, it's certainly something they could do. I know some congregations have even shifted to doing services online or through Zoom so that folks actually have the opportunity to participate in the service without, traveling to the house of worship, but it is an ongoing concern because of the policy change from this administration. Um, we have got so many great questions. We've only got a few more minutes left. And I wanted to address the folks that are asking specific questions about DACA and what might happen to DACA. I just want to acknowledge that right now there is sort of an uncertain, open question about what will happen to the DACA program. And there is, of course, ongoing sort of litigation and trying to understand. There's a lot of uncertainty. Unfortunately, we have seen the administration target some DACA recipients and arrest them and put them in ICE custody. It's a really concerning trend and something that we have really been asking members of Congress to speak out about. And I know that especially Congresswoman Delia Ramirez from Illinois has been really outspoken about the need for protection for DACA recipients while they're in an uncertain place right now. I think we are almost at time. I see there right here, there's a question about whether this SNAP rule will affect special immigrant visa SIV populations. It does. And so I think that's important to take into note that the categories for SNAP have been dramatically limited in terms of who is eligible. But just because one person in a family might lose eligibility, it doesn't mean every single person in that family loses eligibility. So it is still important to look at the status of individual members because we know that many families are made up of folks with different immigration statuses. So just wanted to keep that reminder there. We're almost at time, and I just want to acknowledge a question that just came in about the citizenship test. There have been a number of changes to the citizenship test and the process of application, including more rigorous vetting of the applicants. And so I just want to also acknowledge that with all so many changes to all different stages of the immigration process, it can be a lot to keep up with. We do offer biweekly briefings that are free and available for anyone who's interested. And I will make sure that that link for that also goes out to folks. So if you are interested in getting updates from the ILRC on a regular basis, you can register and join those webinars, and they are fantastic.
And I just want to jump in. Thank you, Nithya, for providing such great information. We will be sharing out the presentation and a lot more resources with the presentation as well. As Nithya said, she had some fee and resources to share out. And then we will also share out the ILRC link so you can go into the website and find more information, resources, and join their listserv as well. And with that, thank you, Nithya, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.